All right. Well, thank you guys, Mike and Ton, for hosting me and taking care of all of this. And yeah, if folks have questions in the chat, I'm not going to be able to see that very easily while I'm discussing. So please, Ton or Mike or whomever, just interrupt me whenever you feel it's appropriate. And I'm happy with some interruptions throughout the presentation. I tend to get kind of long-winded, especially in the evening when I'm tired. So all right, so I'm going to be talking about herbaceous plants. Basically, these are leafy plants. They're non-woody, no secondary xylem and phloem, kind of a little review from your botany information. But my outline today, by the way, I should probably go back and introduce myself a little bit more. So I am in Weber County, and I also cover Morgan County is my horticulture role, and the Ogden Botanical Gardens, which is a 12-acre garden, public garden in Ogden. So we get thousands of visitors come through there every year on a yearly basis. We do a lot of educational outreach there, a lot of events and things like that. So it's a great place to visit, totally free to the public. And it takes some work, a good place for the volunteers to go out and learn and help plant all these wonderful herbaceous plants that we grow. So the outline for today, so mostly I'm going to be focusing on annuals and perennials primarily today. And we're going to talk a little bit about climate, and I want to touch also on design concepts, just very surface level. I don't know if you guys do much training on design down there. We did one up here in Weber for our Master Gardeners last year, but we didn't squeeze one in this year. So I like to touch on that a little bit. I'm also going to address some frequently asked questions that I get as a horticulture agent, but also you as Master Gardeners to kind of help guide you when you're working with the public. We'll talk about bulbs and some maintenance guidelines for perennials. And then with annuals, we're going to talk about some bed design and annual containers. And then at the end, I'll mention some common insect pests. So that's sort of the outline for today. So of course, I'm up in Weber County. We have a slightly cooler climate where we're at least a couple weeks behind you guys down in Utah County in terms of what we see blooming this time of year. So my presentation is kind of based off of what it's looking like more around here, but I tried to broaden it out across the Wasatch Front as best as I can. So starting out with perennials. So just a little review. These are herbaceous plants that live, and some of them are actually woody, but they live more than 2 seasons. So a plant that only lives 2 seasons long is considered a biennial, and it goes through its whole life cycle in 2 years. And a lot of the times we consider even a perennial that's a little bit marginal that won't survive longer than 2 years, that could be considered a biennial or a short-lived perennial. So also it's important to understand your hardiness zone. So I think as Master Gardeners, you're probably pretty well aware of that, what that terminology exactly means. But basically, there's a number designated to certain winter temperatures. And the lower the number, the colder it gets. So when you're choosing perennials, you want to be aware of what your hardiness zone is. And how to look that up is to go to the USDA hardiness zone website and look at your area. And you can get a good judge from that. So you guys are probably like a 5, 6, might even get away with a zone 7 in a nice microclimate. So, and then bloom time with most perennials, I would say average about 3 to 4 weeks. We do have a lot of really neat, very long-term blooming perennials as well. But just to keep in mind, when you're out shopping and you see these beautiful perennials in full bloom at the nursery, they may not last a whole lot longer, especially after transplant, depending on the variety and species that you're purchasing. So just keep bloom time in mind. And then, so that kind of spills into planning for color throughout the season and interest. So there are thousands of varieties to choose from. There's been so much plant breeding and propagation going on to just pick the most coveted type characteristics that work great in our gardens. And so more and more, it just makes the choices a little bit overwhelming. So in this presentation, I try to keep it from feeling too overwhelming. And then maybe for some of you, like real garden gurus that know your perennials really well, trying to balance it out. So we're not overwhelming people and striking that balance between the really knowledgeable and maybe others that are kind of new to gardening and perennial gardens, as well as annual gardening. So, and then in terms of maintenance, I think that a lot of people, they look at, they think, okay, I'm going to put in this landscape and I'm going to use mostly perennials because that's going to be really low maintenance. And in my opinion, it's not always really the case at all. I mean, all perennials are going to need cutting back. A lot of perennials require pruning and deadheading. And then you always have weeds that come up. You have that competition. And it's almost more difficult to weed a perennial bed if you do have weed pressure than it would be something like a vegetable garden, because you're not going to be planting in rows where you can go and cultivate between and things like that. Of course, we always have herbicides and pre-emergence and things. But even herbicide application can be a challenge because you have desirable plants along with undesirable plants. Dividing, a lot of perennials do require division. So that's also something to keep in mind. That's something that's going to occur over time. And of course, pest control can always be a bit of a pressure depending on your situation. So rather than thinking of it as maybe a super low maintenance scenario, maybe we think of it more as a low input. So as opposed to maintaining turf grass, which does take, weekly mowing and, regular fertilization, depending on what your program is there, sometimes aeration and chemical application, and that's all maintenance too. But it's a lot of input there of all these different fertilizers and these different weed controls and things like that. So anyway, so I just kind of wanted to reiterate that sometimes perennial beds aren't necessarily entirely low maintenance. So in terms of climate, hopefully you are all familiar with our Climate Center website. But here it is right here. And so it's climate.usu.edu. This is a great resource when trying to kind of wrap your brain around things like pests and plant management and other climate data. Utah Pests, or the Utah Traps link is there as well. But this is kind of my go-to tab. That's not going to tell you your hardiness zone, or at least I don't know where it would be located within this particular website, but it does give you like the freeze-free dates and things like that. So if you're interested in navigating through that and getting some information, it's a great website. Moving on to landscape designs. So the example I have here is one that is kind of indicating a more sort of a very broad design. This is kind of where if you're starting from scratch or totally renovating, or you have a new property and you're trying to install a landscape, some of the things that you would want to look at. And this is what the folks who are in landscape design are all going to be looking at as they're trying to design a landscape. So looking at where utilities are, particularly things like power lines and other, gas lines, things, or other undesirable existing utilities that maybe you want to block using plant material or anything else like that. Thinking about your views, what views you want to keep, what views you want to block. What are your climatic conditions in the space? So we can see some things like wind and sun indicated there. You know, heat coming off of driveways and roads and things like that. So just make really good observations about your site, and that's really the key before you do any major planning, and that's just going to save you a lot of hassle in the long term. So I also included this website on Localscapes. I feel like they do a really good job. So Localscapes is a program based out of the Jordan Valley Water Conservation District. That's and the garden park there in Salt Lake. And they've kind of taken that over, and they do some really good classes, but they also have a lot of great online content in terms of trying to conceptualize how to design a landscape in a very conservation focused approach. So that's a great resource, and I also chose that one because I was looking up some tutorials. I'm pretty sure it was Localscapes who, when I found it on YouTube, there was a really nice, pretty simple tutorial that kind of showed how you can do this simple landscape design markup and the things you can look at and the measurements you need to make and how to do that using a Google satellite. So there's a lot of resources out there. But I just wanted to throw out this as a basic kind of a way to conceptualize and wrap your brain around it a little bit, because I know it can be a little bit overwhelming. But, you know, again, this is a very broad example, but when we're thinking about perennials, I mean, they're more of sort of the accent and the filler. They can really act that way, but they really have an important place in the landscape. And so the things that I like to emphasize when doing a site assessment and choosing perennials are things like really knowing your space, how much space you have, actually measuring that, making a good measurement so that you know what to look for in terms of size of perennials, because there's a lot of variation in size as well and how much you can incorporate. So and then also think about your soil type, because that's going to affect, and we talk a lot about soil in the Master Gardener classes and getting soil tests and things like that, but it's definitely going to affect what type of plants that you can incorporate in the landscape. Look at your wind. Wind makes a big difference. I used to live in Cache County. I lived in Logan for several years. And now I'm living in Box Elder County or Brigham City, and we're kind of on the bench right where that sort of exit out of Sardine Canyon kind of loops around that first exit. And so we get a ton of wind just bellowing out of the canyon on a very regular basis. And it definitely changes the climate that we're used to having quite a bit. So sun exposure too, that's huge. Just understanding where the sun's going to be hitting at what time of year and how you can plan around that. And then slopes as well. That, you know, that can be a challenge to plant on slopes. You get a lot of runoff. Water doesn't infiltrate the soil very well. So how can we manage that? So really pay attention to slopes as well as microclimates. I think people, everyone has several microclimates, even in their own personal landscape. And basically all a microclimate is just it's an area where the climate in this particular location is a little bit different than the surrounding climate, the surrounding landscape. And so if you can really think of it on a micro scale, you know, we all have microclimates, several of them throughout our entire landscape. And so being able to judge what that is, and sometimes it's just, you know, you have more trees here, so you have more shelter from wind, you have more humidity, and more shade, or you're on a west facing area, so it's way more exposed and way more warm in the summer, late afternoons, but cooler in the mornings, things like that. So try to evaluate those and plan accordingly. Hydrozones is a really big one. So that's basically knowing your irrigation system and knowing where your zones within your irrigation system are and how maybe you can manipulate it so that you're grouping plant materials with same and or similar water needs rather than overwatering certain plants to compensate for those that require a little bit more water. So that's a really key, especially in water-wise landscaping and water conservation sort of planning, especially with perennials. So again, I mentioned height and width variation. Keep that in mind in terms of planting plants, your bloom time, and choosing color schemes. So if there's a color scheme you're interested in, I'll talk a little bit about color a little bit later on in the presentation here. So, so here we go again with color and texture. So when we're thinking of design utilizing perennials, you know, I feel like color is a big thing that we look for. We want that long-term bloom, but texture is a big one in my book. And sometimes color doesn't even just mean bloom, but it also can be colorful foliage and things like that. So keep that in mind. Having some kind of interest year-round can definitely help. And there are some perennials that are slightly evergreen, and of course our ornamental grasses that we can keep uncut throughout the winter to give you even a longer lasting interest throughout the year. I like the concept of being able to have some way of leading the eye throughout the entire landscape, or at least to focal point certain areas that maybe you would like to showcase in your landscape, whether it's a kind of a gathering area or something that is, you know, provides really good curb appeal, sort of, so to speak, gathering areas and things like that. So, and the way we can kind of do that to just sort of lead the eye throughout the landscape is by repetition. And that doesn't necessarily mean the exact same plant throughout the landscape, but maybe just really similar, whether it's height wise, whether it's color, whether it's a similar shape of a plant, even when that comes to trees and shrubs. So there's different ways. You don't always have to use the same plant material to kind of create that feeling of repetition throughout the landscape. And then eye catchers and things like that. So I mentioned that. And then the other thing I love is utilizing pathways. So so this is an example, and this is my yard in Brigham City. That's just kind of, you know, I've just been slowly getting to it. You know, when you manage 12 acres, you know, your yard kind of is just on the back burner. But this was an area where my son used to always run straight through. This is a mound. It's kind of hard to tell, but it's slightly mounding. We've got some perennials. We had to renovate that, and so some things are starting to come up a bit. But my son would always run clear through the middle, so we decided to give him a little pathway. But we actually utilized a living pathway of a steppable ground cover, so that's way fun. But I do love pathways. I love the idea of being able to meander through the garden and not be actually walking and stepping on plants, but really being part of meandering through the garden. So I always think it's a fun thing to incorporate into the landscape. So, and just remember that gardens, they're not permanent, they're dynamic. So if something's not working, or if you don't like it, you can always change it. I know it's always a little bit of an investment, but it doesn't always turn out exactly how you envision it. So we might come up with these great extravagant plans, and it doesn't always end up exactly that way. And that's kind of the fun of it. So we go through the process and we learn as we go, and we can change based on what's going to work in our unique situations. and visions and desires and all that sort of fun stuff. So here's my my little show and tell. So this, you know, hopefully it kind of gives you all an idea on some of the design things, the ways we have gone about it at the Ogden Botanical Gardens. And anyway, so this is our brand new, I was really distracted. My husband just texted me. He did not realize I was teaching tonight. Ooh, this is fun. Okay, so this is our brand new pollinator garden out at the Ogden Botanical Gardens. We just installed all of this. It finally finished it towards the end of summer last year. It's not a huge space, but it's fairly large. And so what we kind of did here, and this is sort of what I talked about, where how I love having the pathways, having the ability for our visitors to be able to really interact throughout the garden and walk and meander through. And so what we're trying to really do here is create like this spiral effect from an aerial view, but also meanwhile having this really nice pathway and dividing the different sections of the garden utilizing that pathway. And in the center here, we're going to have a bird bath. So that should be installed this summer. So anyway, we've got the different sections. So I mentioned we have sections. So what we tried to do is really, I mean, it's more of an educational as well as just very, you know, kind of artistic, fancy type of garden. But we tried to separate it into separate gardens where we've got one specifically more for bees. And
Helen,
this one, yeah.
we've got a question. What substrate did you use for your pathways, and how do you keep it weed free?
Oh, great. Okay, yeah. So this is, well, I will show you that. But we used road base, and then this is sandstone we got from American Stone, and then we just got sand as filler. So that's all it was. And we did put some weed barrier below it, which I know is only going to last for so long before we start, those weeds are going to come up through the sand. But that's the beauty about pathways, and I apologize to you organic gardeners out there, but we definitely will probably be spot spraying some of these areas. But the nice thing is we're not really harming any plant material. We don't have to, you know, spray in between the plants or anything, just on the pathways. So that's kind of the plan there. All right, so we have the 4 different sections. We got bees, butterflies, birds, and these are beneficials. And we've kind of mixed, it's not all only strictly perennials. We've used several shrubs and grasses and ground covers and reseeding annuals. But most of them, for the most part, are low water plants and more native varieties. So the way we designed this is we took a Google satellite shot, and we used this homeoutside.com software to be able to kind of conceptualize this and plan out, starting with the pathway, what that would look like. Now, this dark area here, this is a pathway that will be installed, but it just got contracted out this spring. So it's still not there as of yet. But so that was kind of how we came up with the design. There, like I said, there's a lot of different softwares out there that you can utilize. You know, just kind of however you like to conceptualize it. Or if you're more of just an artist who likes graph paper and things like that, you can just take your measurements using Google Satellites and then draw your mat based on that. So you can see the sections here, we've kind of marked it out. And that helped us a lot, so we could actually have a printable version so we could show our visitors, this is what's coming, this is why it's looking kind of funny and bare right now, but this is what's coming, so you can look forward to it. So anyway, there's our map, and then our next step was to come up with a big list of plant material that we knew would be really great pollinator plants, and then from there we even kind of went through and sifted out so we could kind of categorize between our hummingbirds, our butterflies, and our bees, so we could further sort of categorize it into our little sections. And again, I mean, there's definitely going to be a lot of overlap in terms of pollinators, but it's really cool for the visitors to kind of see, oh, this is the hummingbird garden. This is the kind of plant, these are the kind of plants that I could plant at home to get more hummingbird visitors in my garden. And they can actually see that as they're meandering through. So that's kind of what we did there. There's a lot of great resources. As you can see, we've also used some ground covers and some cover crops and things like that that are going to need to be managed so that they don't take over. But we wanted to really demonstrate the use of that. And it was very strategically located next to our edible demonstration garden. So sorry, I scrolled down a little too far. I'm good. Just a minute. Hey, go away. Sorry, guys. There we go. All right. Almost there. All right, so here's our process. Somebody asked what is the material for the pathway. So here's the dump truck coming and dumping out our road base and our sand and our sandstone, just our little staging area in the back of the gardens. And meanwhile, we're hand digging out, you know, we're going down, you know, 3-4 inches deep to lay our pathway down. And I'm also, so I'm out there spraying. So we had to kill this grass. And again, I apologize to you organic gardeners out there, but we wanted to expand this area. Thank you. We wanted to expand this area quite a bit. This used to be all annual bed, and I've got a photo of that towards the end of the presentation where we would plant annuals. And so this has been a really good transition in terms of just the investment, the annual investment. We did one big investment. We had some grant funding to do it. And, you know, hopefully this will be a pretty sustainable area. But I did have to do several applications of Killzall to get this, to make sure I had a good kill on this grass. So that took probably about a month to make sure I got a good kill on it. And to be honest, there is some grass coming back up. So we're battling it still. But it's really, really important. Turf grass can be really hard to kill. So you want to make sure if you're renovating or if you're transitioning from turf to perennials or any other kind of garden that you get a good kill on it. So what we did after that is we just applied about 3 inches or so of compost that we get from the green waste just up the road from us. And we kind of let all that dead turf grass, the blades, the crowns, and even some of the roots just break down within about a 3-week period. And then it was fairly tillable at that point. It was still a little bit rough to till, but we could work it in. And then here is my master gardeners getting those beautiful brand new plants installed into the garden. So that was my little fun show and tell, and that was a super fun project, and I hope this year it thrives, but it's still just a baby. So all right, so just a few of the frequently asked questions that I get as an extension agent, and probably you too as well, being master gardeners working out with the public. So the first and biggest question is what can I plant that's going to bloom all summer or all season? So and that's definitely a great, it's a fun question, and I've got a resource for that. The second question I often get is, you know, I want to do all xeriscaping or xeriscaping. Actually, a lot of people call it xeriscaping, but it's actually xeriscaping. And that basically is just water-wise gardening, and I'll address that as well. And then what should I plant in a spot that is blank? So just the tough spots, and that can be challenging. And I like to really focus on just very adaptable plants that are either natively or bred or cultivars of plants that are already adapted to Utah soils. So But some of them specifically would be plants that are deer resistant, plants that are, you know, only on the west facing side of the house, so they get only that hot afternoon sun. Plants for dry, shady areas or dry slopes and things like that. Okay, so to address the top question number one, plants that bloom all summer. I like to just remind everyone to consider season-long interest. So rather than just bloom time, but how can we incorporate more colorful foliage and textures to keep that interest going? And you can also always supplement with annuals or biennials in the right situations. And I've certainly done that in some situations. As well as flowering planters and other garden decor, just anything to kind of add a little bit of extra interest throughout the season. And of course, a mixture of bloom times. So you'll see throughout this presentation, I've kind of broken up into about like spring, summer, fall bloomers, so that you can kind of stagger what's going to be blooming and really get a good mixture. So you have that season-long interest. So the second question is, I want to do a xeric landscape, or so what are some really good water-wise perennials? And then the first thing I just, you know, wanted to depict here, and I think we're really starting to move away from that idea of xeriscaping, looking at like a landscape that looks like this with no plants whatsoever. I mean, definitely you're not having to utilize very much water, but you can reduce your water use almost to the exact same extreme and have a landscape look like this. So really transitioning from xeriscaping to water-wise is kind of our goal in terms of terminology and how people really view that. So again, I mentioned establishment because even really well adapted and water-wise plants do require some babying to get established. So you're going to irrigate almost as though you're establishing any regular plant at all, at least for the first year, and then you can start to taper off, and then you can really reduce your watering quite a bit. So again, I have to reiterate hydrozones. So that's really important with water-wise landscaping. You definitely don't want these super drought tolerant perennials on the same zone as your turf grass, because you will definitely overwater them and they will not be happy. So keep that in mind. Some really fun resources. We got the Center for Water Efficient Landscaping up on campus. And they've got a lot of good resources on their website. I've got that reference at the end of my presentation. Public gardens to visit. Of course, you guys have the Thanksgiving Point, Ogden Botanical Gardens. We're very conservation focused. We've got a water-wise garden area. We also have a conservation garden area. So we're very focused on really low water. Same with the USU Botanical Center, which I believe this is where that photo is taken. And the Jordan Valley Conservation Garden, as well as Red Butte. So a lot of the public gardens, if you can go visit those, gives you some great ideas. Visiting your local nurseries. They're really branching out, trying to just provide what the customer demands. And if there's something that you want and you request it, they will sometimes be able to order things for you. But they definitely listen to those requests because they want to make money. They want to sell things. If there's a public demand for water-wise perennials, then they will have some on hand. And they know what's on the up. So they know the cool new varieties that are coming in. And most of the workers are, you know, willing to learn and even test them out in their own yards and see how well they work. So that's a great resource for you too. I find High Country Gardens to be a really nice, intuitive website, really helpful in terms of conceptualizing and sort of narrowing down your options. You do have to be careful sometimes. I think for you guys in Utah County, it's not that big of a deal, but I've noticed that they do sell a lot of perennials that are, you know, like a zone 7 and things like that, that just don't necessarily do that great in further north, especially places like Cache County or Eden, you know, up in the valleys and things. So just be aware of that. But they definitely, they even categorize it into deer resistance, pollen, you know, hummingbirds and pollinators, water wise. They'll have a garden plan and things like that. So it's kind of a cool website. And then of course I mentioned Localscapes. So deer resistant options, that's always a big question. I think most of us in Utah deal with deer pressure, or have at some point, or will eventually. And, you know, I really think the main thing to focus on is, well, exclusion for the first part, but sometimes we can't really control that so much. But also just more native or Utah adapted plants, because these are plants that deer tend to shy away from, whether it's the texture or the flavor or the smell, or they're just plants that can tolerate the browsing. Not to say that deer will not try and browse, but they may not come back and visit that same plant. And so if you surround yourself with those types of plants, then you've got a good fighting chance. And my point that I want to make here with this slide, and this is just a few examples of things that are deer resistant. So you have a whole lot of options. You can have a beautiful perennial garden that the deer will not bother. So, and of course that's going to depend on the year. And if all else fails, you can use the deer fencing. It's a granular. It's fairly expensive, but you can buy some online. We have to use it at the Ogden Botanical Gardens to protect our roses. But anyway, there are a lot of options out there. So utilize this reference, and there's also references online through other universities, as well as Utah State. And here's a great example. This is one of my favorites, one of my favorite perennials, and you'll see a picture of that show up again. But this is wine cups. So I just want to make sure I give that one a showcase real quick. This is a nice low growing, deer resistant, water wise, sun loving, beautiful perennial. Other tough spots. So this is another sort of show and tell of mine. We came up with a fact sheet. Well, it's more of a bulletin because it got really long, but it's mostly just pictures and descriptions. And this is for plants that will thrive in dry shade. So particularly under like really dense evergreens and things like that. So this one, I worked with Larry Rupp. He's now retired, but he was the director of the Sewell Group, and he was a professor on campus, extension specialist in native plants and water conservation. And he said, we get a lot of these questions on what can we plant in dry shade. So just a minute, I need to shut my door. We've got someone out there vacuuming. Okay, that's a little better. So anyway, we came up with a big long list of plants that we knew would be really drought resistant and really adaptable. And, you know, the biggest challenge was that, you know, a lot of these native plants and water-wise plants, they're kind of adapted to full sun, and that's why they can tolerate drought. So how do we find things that do well in shade? And it turns out there's quite a few choices. And so we had it sent out to our public garden association participants and had people rate some of the plants on our list, those that they've grown, and where they grew them and how well they did. And then from there, we narrowed it down to the top 15. So, and most of those are included in this presentation. So that's kind of a good resource if that question ever comes up. That's easy to find online if you just Google plants for dry shade, USU Extension. Okay, sorry, I'm scrolling too quickly here. All right, so our long-term blooming perennials. So I've got a pretty good list here, and all of these are definitely long-term bloomers. Some of them maybe aren't, though. I've got a few that they actually don't bloom very, very long, like the Renera here, which I'll talk about, but they have interesting foliage. Or it's something that you can deadhead or cut back, and then you'll get a rebloom. So that's where I've kind of stuck in a few that you may be thinking, well, this doesn't actually bloom for that long, but it does create some year-round interest, or it will flush out more than once in the season. And I just wanted to make sure you all knew. So everything that's typed in red is water-wise. So I've tried to indicate that on each slide. I'm also separating plants between sun and shade. So the other thing I should mention about some of our long-term bloomers, so it really kind of depends on the plant itself, but a lot of these that bloom into late summer and basically through October until we get a hard freeze and they start to really go dormant, you'll still have flowers on them, but they tend to not really get going until it's pretty hot out. And I think for you guys, that's a lot earlier than it is for us, but just keep that in mind. So it's kind of more that early to mid spring that you would want to focus on in terms of coloration if you're mixing some of these long-term bloomers for a full season interest. So I'm moving into spring. So I'm going to cover spring and then summer and then fall. So here's just a basic list, trying not to overwhelm you too much. Some pretty common plants. And then I've further subdivided it besides between sun and shade, but then early, mid, and late. So, and I put that as April, May, June, but it really depends on the year and where you are along the Wasatch Front in terms of what's early, mid, or late. But I like to think of it April through June. And we've kind of had a slower spring, at least up here in Ogden. So we're just starting to see things really get going and starting to bloom. But last year, I think at this point, we had a little bit more going on. So anyway, this is a good slide for you to reference, but I'm going to show you some photos and talk about them while you can see what they look like. So peonies, I think most people are fairly familiar with. That's kind of a fun one. It's, you know, here in Ogden, it's just been kind of barely sticking up the past couple weeks, emerging from the soil, but it grows so quickly and turns into this massive plant within a matter of, you know, 3-4 weeks. So that's a really great one. It's also another one that they're using in high tunnels up on campus as a cut flower. So it does really great here in Utah, and I think it's got a lot of interest in the landscape. I definitely love to have at least a couple of peonies in my yard because they're just so stunning. Unfortunately, they don't bloom for very long. Anemone is another one that I really like. So this is Japanese anemone. It's kind of a low growing, about a 6 to 8 inch mounding plant, although it does reseed. Definitely spring blooming. It's adaptable to sun and partial shade. It doesn't do great in full shade, but partial shade for sure. And it's very low water. The only thing about anemone is that it can reseed quite easily. The seed pods are really cool looking, and they show a lot of interest. But so it's just kind of up to you how tidy you like your garden. I think it's kind of an alpine looking plant in my opinion, and I like it, and I used to let it just kind of go to seed and do its own thing in the landscape, and it really turned out to be a really good cover, and just absolutely gorgeous when the little alpine field of anemone was blooming in the spring. Baptisia or false indigo is another one that we grow a lot of at the Ogden Botanical Gardens. This is a really fun one. I don't think a lot of people are as familiar with this plant as I would have expected them to be, but this is one that's kind of a later spring blooming somewhat. It's another really slow one in the spring where you don't even see it emerging for quite a while in the spring, but then all of a sudden it just becomes this massive perennial with this really neat, so it's in the legume family. It has a pea-like really cool foliage on it, and when it does go to seed, it has a really neat legume-like, pea-like seed pod. So they're really quite stunning, kind of a late bloomer, but the blooms will last a month or so. And so that one does really well. It likes a lot full sun to partial shade. There's also another variety that's purple and yellow. Another one that I really like is Jacob's Ladder. That's kind of a part shade. The regular Jacob's Ladder can handle full sun. There's actually a native variety that can handle full sun. The variegated does better in partial shade, and it's a little bit less of a prolific bloomer. But this is kind of a mid-spring sun to partial shade. The blossoms smell very sweet, and the bees absolutely love it. The blooms only last, I would say, 2 to 3 weeks, but if you trim it down after it blooms, it will rebloom for you, and it will rebloom one to 2 more times a season, depending on your climate. There was one more thing but if you don't trim it down and you allow it to go to seed, it will definitely reseed. And then allium's another one that's just flowering onion. I think these are great. They look fantastic in the landscape, and they're just easy. They're usually sold as bulbs. They can handle mostly shade to full sun. They're pretty short-lived, but they're typically in bloom at the same time as these anemones and the peonies, and I think that's really a nice mixture of spring blooms. So what's blooming now? You guys probably have a little bit more than we do at the moment. These are just a few things through a few pictures I took this spring, although this one was taken last June, but we've got some primrose also blooming out at the Ogden Botanical Gardens. Hask flower, this is the very first flower that blooms in my yard, even before the daffodils and tulips, and it's still going strong. That's a really fun, beautiful spring flower. Lungwort is beginning to bloom, or pulmonaria. Here's heliobore or lantern rose. These are nice early spring, beautiful perennials. Brunera is another one. That was kind of on the list, and it has a nice little forget-me-not flower. I've got another close-up of that. That's more of a shade plant. And then there's some early spring iris in bloom right now. Okay, also for partial to full shade. So if you have all full shade or close to full shade, some of these plants will do pretty well. Most of these plants will do pretty well. A still bee will do well. Monkshood Lamiastrium, that's a really nice one. That can actually handle a little bit more than just partial sun shade, or it can handle quite a bit of sun. But if it's in that hot afternoon sun, it requires a little bit more water. But this is a very low water plant. Um, so I'm a big fan of this. It only blooms for a couple weeks, but if you trim it back, it'll rebloom. It has this nice yellow orchid-looking bloom on it. And it really pops in the shade because of this really interesting variegated foliage, which is really quite pretty. And it just stays, you know, about 1 foot. It has it's a nice tidy little plant. It doesn't spread or go crazy on you. So here's another example of lungwort or pulmonaria. Here's the Brunnera again, the little tiny forget-me-not-like blooms on them with, this one is, I just wanted to show you the foliage on the Jack Frost variety. So that's really great for shade. The Brunnera is actually low, very low water. We would consider it a water-wise plant, and especially in the deep shade. But if you get this Jack Frost version, it's really nice to have that really light colored foliage in the shade. It kind of helps just give some more color and light into the shade. It really pops. So, and then Tiarella is another fairly common shade perennial. And what I like about it is it not only does it bloom, and you can get different colors as well, but they also they have a lot of different varieties and cultivars that have a lot of different foliage, colorations in the foliage, which can be really fun in the shade. So when it's done blooming, you still have that cool texture and coloration of the foliage. So this is what I kind of call my spring to summer transition. I think for some that is kind of a challenging moment because we have all our spring blooming and they last, you know, 2 to 4 weeks. And then we have this sort of dead space before it gets really hot, and then all our summer bloomings start to pop. So we need some kind of filler here that's going to be our sort of our late spring to summer transition bloomers. And so that's kind of my list that I came up with here. So there's a lot of different varieties of poppies that are usually blooming late spring, and they have a long-term bloom. So that's a really nice one. This is the Soul Dancer Daisy. That one gets started early or late spring and then blooms throughout the summer. That's one of our Sago Supreme plants. Columbine, also kind of a late spring bloomer. And there's other varieties that bloom a little bit longer in the summer or flush in and out throughout the season. Same with blue flax. That's a little bit of a later spring bloomer. Campanula, that's a fun one. So that's bellflower. And that comes in a lot of different varieties and cultivars as well, in terms of height and color and shape. So it's really interesting how much variation there is within this plant. But this one in particular is kind of a late spring when it gets started blooming, and it has a pretty long-term bloom, and you can keep it blooming throughout the summer if you deadhead slightly as those blossoms start to fade. But this is one of the clips varieties. So there's blue clips and white clips, and they're nice little tidy mounding, about 6-inch mounded plants. So really, really great for just like as a tidy little border plant. They do well in partial sun to full sun. They can be low water depending on the soil type and how much sun exposure. So that's a very versatile, very long-term bloomer. And then the penstemon, of course, there's hundreds of varieties of penstemon available, and that's another one that they're constantly breeding and coming up with new varieties with longer blooming times and things like that. But in terms of like just a late spring, early summer variety, these are the native varieties, the Rocky Mountain and the Firecracker, and that's what I used to grow. up in Logan. I don't have those varieties this year. I've got some other varieties though that are blooming all summer long once they start to get going. So that's really fun and exciting. So that's just a few examples. So penstemons are a great go-to. Very water-wise, you don't want to overwater those, but they definitely prefer more sun. As much sun as you can give them, they prefer that. I'm seeing a lot of blinking happening in the chat, so just interrupt me if you need to.
No, Helen, you're good. We have a medicinals herbalist that is providing information about some of the plants, so you're
cool.
fine.
Oh, great. That's awesome. Well, thank you. We've got a lot of herb gurus too out here in Weber County. So hopefully you all can get to know each other and share your knowledge. All right, so here's some late spring combinations. These photos were taken years ago at the Ogden Botanical Gardens, but just to kind of show you how nice and beautiful things can look in the late spring. Again, some poppies. We got a couple of different varieties here. Here's some columbine. This is the Homestead Purple Verbena. That's a real beautiful and perennial, but kind of short-lived. It didn't come back. It's not been there existing in the garden since I've been there. This is the Husker Red penstemon. You can see that dark purple foliage. That's really nice. It is a long-term bloomer, but definitely the foliage, it's nice to break up that green a little bit with some darker foliage. So that's a really nice touch. And we've got a lot of hyssop, which I'll talk about. This orange one here, that's orange globe mallow. This is all our water-wise demonstration garden in here. And then some iris and things in the background there. So, and I always like to mention ground covers, and this is just a few of them that, you know, I like to recommend because they've just done well for me, but there are lots and lots of different types of ground covers you can use. So again, red indicates water-wise, and they're divided between sun and shade. You'll see the Veronica or Speedwell, and phlox probably should have been highlighted red. That's pretty low water. So, and rock cress as well. So the Veronica can be sun or shade. So that's a really nice one. So take note of that. Here's what they sort of look like. So the phlox should be blooming now, and probably about at least a week ago down in Utah County. But it comes in lots of different colors and varieties, purples, hot pinks, light pinks, whites, striped, all sorts of different colors. And that's a nice spring blooming ground cover. And same with the rock cress. That comes in a lot of different colors as well. And those both do really well on rock walls and kind of dry areas as well. So those are really great ground covers. Here's the creeping speedwell or Veronica. This particular one is the Turkish speedwell. They also have, they come in different colors and different styles, but this one's my favorite just because of how densely matted it is. But absolutely beautiful, intense blue flower. Sweet woodruff, this one loves the shade and dry shade as well. So this one is actually very adaptable to that dry, shady area we referred to. And it blooms very briefly in the spring, but you know, nice sweet smell, hence the name. Really interesting foliage. It's a really neat ground cover for a shady area. And ajuga as well works really well in the shade, and that's a really tough, hardy perennial with a pretty nice purple tall spike of blossoms in the spring. So a few things you can do with ground covers. We've got some examples here. So here's the Veronica, and that's growing and starting to creep up over this mound. This is a mound here. It's kind of hard to tell, but that's in its full glory in the spring. You can see some grass growing up through it. That was hard to manage, but really intense blue color. And then when those blossoms fade in a few weeks, it'll be just a nice dark emerald glossy green dense matte over that whole area. And it's also very steppable. So that's pretty fun. And then around the mound is the thyme path. So thyme is also very steppable and can handle a good amount of foot traffic. But you can see this is the woolly thyme. So it's got a kind of a light fuzzy, light sagey green color to the foliage. And then it comes out in a purple bloom. And the bees go nuts on that in the spring. And here's an example of one of my master gardeners who lives up in Eden. And she has this circular driveway around this area here where she's got some ornamentals and things towards the center, and then decided to just fill in with these water-wise ground covers. And this is all primarily a mixture of different kinds of creeping thyme. And so she barely has to water that, only as needed. It's very, very low water. And it really creates, and she calls it her ground cover lawn alternative. And it's a really large space, and it's filled in quite nicely. And you can see all the alterations in color when it's all in bloom. Of course, when I was out there, not everything was quite in bloom at the same time, but I've seen pictures, and it's really astounding. So there's a lot you can do with ground covers, and it's nice to utilize them where you can. I love to use them as living pathways. I think that's super fun. Oops, I keep scrolling down too quickly. At the end of the day, the computer just wants to do whatever it wants. All right, so spring bulbs. So just to name a few, there's lots of different types of bulbs. These are all that are listed here. Typical plants that are sold as bulbs that would be planted in the fall. So perennial bulbs. And then I just included a little box here to provide some definitions of bulbs, because a lot of the times anything that we plant in the ground in the fall is a bulb, but it may not technically be a bulb. It may be a rhizome or a tuber, stolon, spur, crown, those kind of things. So, well, spur, not really, that's more of a modified stem. But anyway, so I gave you some definitions and examples here, just so you can have that kind of clear in your head. But regardless, we're spring bulbs, they're super fun. Iris is one that can be a little bit later spring or earlier spring, depending on the variety. And some of them will bloom even late summer. So iris are really nice bulbs to utilize, or actually technically rhizomes, I guess, but to utilize in the landscape for year-long interest. All right, and so in terms of bulbs, planting depth, so there's a little chart for you to reference how deeply to plant and how far apart to plant your bulbs. There's only a few of these that aren't meant to be planted in the fall, like the dahlias and the cannas. Those are more on the annual side. They don't always overwinter as bulbs in the ground, and I usually recommend planting those in the spring around the same time you would plant your other annuals. So they can tolerate some amount of cold, but they do far better planted in the spring. And you can start them earlier indoors if you want, just to kind of push up the growth a little bit quicker, because they can be a little bit slow going in the spring. So anyway, and then that's the bloom time, that's the planting depth. And the important thing to know is when you see that on the package, that's really how deep you want to dig the hole. That's not how far buried it needs to be. That's the depth based on the base of the bulb to the soil surface, not the top of the bulb. So you don't want to plant them too deep, or you're not going to get much of a plant the following year. All right, some summer blooming. And again, you'll see a little bit of overlap on some of these perennials in terms of just what I've listed. But again, red is water wise. And some of these are types of perennials that will rebloom upon deadheading or trimming back, or perennials that have a interesting foliage that can continue and to provide you with some long-term interest, particularly some of these shade perennials. So here's the Veronica. So I mentioned the ground cover Veronica. This is the upright version, or Speedwell. This is an example of the Royal Candles variety. So that's really nice. Late spring to early summer blooming, and then it can handle some cutting back, and then that will re-stimulate another flush of blooms. Lady's Mantle is a shade perennial, low growing, spreading, and it has a nice sort of inconspicuous bloom, but they're really quite cute and pretty. They don't last super long, but what I really like about it is the foliage. It's very soft and fuzzy, and water beads up on it when you irrigate or when it rains. So that's a really, really nice shade perennial. Same with the Corydalus. That's a really nice one. It's actually very low water. It will bloom throughout the season. It starts about late spring, mid to late spring in your case, and it will flush out blooms throughout the season. Cute little yellow blooms, which are great in the shade. It's got a nice fern-like foliage, but it will reseed, so it can spread. So just be aware of that. It's not a very large plant. I think the largest I've seen it is maybe a foot, but in general, it's going to be about 6 to 8 inches in terms of height. Bee balm is another fabulous perennial. Monarda is the more scientific term. This one attracts bees, butterflies, hummingbirds, you name it. Very stunning, very interesting looking flower. They're a good size, you know, maybe almost the size of your fist, depending on the variety. And there's different varieties, so they get different heights. And also different colors. So this one's kind of a purple color. There I've seen dark burgundy, I've seen hot pink, and we're using a lot of that in our pollinator garden as well. They have a really cool smell, kind of a minty smell. And these, if you keep them deadheaded pretty well, you can really extend the bloom time. So typically the bloom time is going to be about 2 weeks. But if you keep them deadheaded, they will bloom a bit longer. This is a sun to partial shade. Here's I mentioned the bellflower or campanula in that previous slide, the clips one that was lower growing. So here's just another variety and another example of a taller, more upright campanula, and the Japanese forest grass in the background. That's called Hakona Cloa. And coral bells, again, for shade. I love to reiterate coral bells because they really provide a lot of really neat pops of color, especially in shady areas. And a lot of varieties of coral bell are, again, very adaptable. We have native varieties here in Utah, but so they're adaptable, fairly adaptable to our soil. They can tolerate a good amount of sun, except for maybe the lime green variety that tend to get leaf scorch. And then again, they'll flush out blooms periodically throughout the season, especially if they're kept deadheaded. But generally, you'll see the biggest flush of blooms in the spring, and they're really mini bells on top of stalks, and they're either white or red or pink. But the biggest thing I like about them is the foliage. Daylilies. So I have the Stella Deora on here. That's a pretty overused landscape plant, in my opinion. a little bit, but at the same time, it serves a really good purpose. It has a fairly long-term bloom, about a month or more. Very prolific in that sense. And then, but when it's not in bloom, it kind of looks like just a nice ornamental grass. So it does definitely have a use in the landscape. And these are fairly low water and adaptable to full sun or partial shade. Hummingbird carpet or Zauschneria. There's also an upright version. Hummingbird trumpet is another term for it. Hummingbirds definitely do like this plant. This is a very long-term bloomer, but it doesn't really like to start to get going until we've definitely had some warm temperatures. But this is one that will bloom until it freezes and the plant goes dormant. Blanket flower is another one that will bloom once it gets fairly warm out and then continue to bloom through fall. Yarrow as well. Yarrow, blanket flower can reseed. You know, it's just one of those that can, but I've never really seen it go too crazy. Yarrow, on the other hand, in certain circumstances can definitely spread quite a bit. But there's a lot of different varieties, and it's a really great perennial for pollinators and beneficials as well. But it gives you that nice long-term bloom as well. And you can, there's again, like a lot of different varieties, so you can get different heights and colors and variations there. And I think it has a really neat smell. I love the foliage. There's a lot about this plant that I really do enjoy. So it definitely has a good space in the landscape. Coreopsis or tickseed is another one. Again, there's tons of varieties of these. This is a very prolific plant. It does really well in Utah and can reseed quite a bit. Same with the Gara. The Gara can reseed. Gara is also referred to as whirling butterflies. I think that's starting to get utilized quite more and more often in our landscapes. But I enjoy this plant. I think a lot of people really appreciate this plant. It's absolutely beautiful the way it wisps around in the wind. It gets to be a really good size. It reseeds fairly easily, but it's just so easy to maintain in terms of irrigation needs and things like that. It grows really well here in our climate. Unless you live in Cache County, then it doesn't do so well because it's a little bit marginal up there. Hyssop is another one that's also often referred to either as hyssop or agastache or agastaki. So there's a couple different terms. I usually stick with either hyssop or agastaki, but commonly it's called hummingbird mint. So that's another one that the hummingbirds really like. This is a fantastic long-term bloomer with a really neat, interesting smell to it. And there's varieties with really cool foliage too. So now they've come up with some with darker, almost purple colored foliage. Lavender, I just had to stick that one in there even though it's a woody plant, but that's a summer bloomer. That's really quite stunning when it's in bloom. The catmint or nepeta, that is one that that has several different varieties, and that's actually in the variety I have in my yard is starting to bloom already early this spring. But that's another one that after that first flush of blooms are spent, if you trim it back pretty good, then you'll get a new flush of blooms. So that's kind of why I put it in that summer category. And so this is a fun one. It can handle partial shade to full sun, and it's a low water plant as well. So here's just some more examples. So here's that Zauschneria or hummingbird carpet, also now called epilobium. This is the Wasatch Fire variety. The blanket flower or gaillardia, just to reiterate, there's a lot of different colors and variations.
Helen?
Yeah.
Did you want to take a break at any time?
I might need to take a short break eventually, yeah.
Okay, when you're ready, go ahead and we'll take 5 or 10 minutes.
Okay, perfect. All right. I wasn't sure. Some people, when we do the Zoom, they don't really take a break, but sometimes I have to just press pause for a minute.
We've generally been doing 5 or 10 minutes to let everybody dash to the fridge or the bathroom. So
Okay, great, great. Okay, good to know. I'll probably in the next few slides we'll do that because we're already at 7:30, huh? Okay. So Nipfolia, red hot poker, that's another fun one. Kind of short-lived, but it's fun. It's drought tolerant, deer resistant. And then ice plants or Delosperma. So this is another low-growing, spreading plant. It's succulent, so it's not so much of a steppable ground cover, but that's kind of a fun one for rock way pathways and rock gardens and things like that. Osteospermum, that's a perennial variety. Most of the time that's the African daisy. Most of the time we purchase these as annuals. But there is a perennial variety as well. There's another example of the Coreopsis or tick seed. This is the moonbeam variety. Again, the agastache or hyssop comes in lots of different colors and varieties. Echinacea or coneflower, and butterfly weed here, Asclepia. Diacia, that's one I don't see as commonly in the landscape, utilized as a perennial, but there are perennial varieties of Diacia, and that's a very drought tolerant, sun-loving perennial. Doesn't get terribly overwhelmingly large, and very sweet, beautiful, light pink flowers. There's the Grosso lavender. And this is the Cooperi Delosperma. This is one of the hardier ice plants. Okay, I've shown this shot already, but this is our hibiscus, and we grow a lot of hibiscus at the Ogden Botanical Gardens. This is a variety I tried in my front yard, which is where it's west facing, right against the house. And it's still just not getting quite as much heat and sunlight as it wants. So it's staying a little darker green. It should be this nice burgundy red, but it's still blooming out quite well. I mean, it's only a year old, and it's obviously got some weed competition here. But absolutely beautiful, massive blooms on it. So I'm a big fan of hibiscus in the right location, and they do get quite large, but they do very well here in Utah, and they're actually drought tolerant. So, and then here's just a couple of pictures of some spring, summer combinations of blooms. I've got the names of the different plants here at the top of the pictures, but these are photos taken at the Ogden Botanical Gardens in our water-wise demonstration area. Most of these I've gone through and covered them already, so. Okay, and this one here is another fun combination. There's some Russian sage in the background, Rudbeckia or Black-Eyed Susan in the forefront. That's kind of a late summer bloomer, blooms into fall. So now we're kind of moving from late summer into fall, and the one in the middle is Lucifer tongue or Lucifer plant is what they call it, but Crocosmia is what I like to call it. It comes in red or in yellow. I really like the red color. This is a really fun plant. It looks very tropical, and the hummingbirds absolutely love it. So this is a really fun one. It likes a lot of sun, and it's drought tolerant. So some of our fall bloomers. For sun, again, mixed between sun and shade. And a lot of these, again, overlapping. Coral bells and the pink anemone is a fall blooming, but the red means water-wise. Here's some examples. Of course, the sedum are a really popular fall blooming plant. These do fantastic. They're low water. They prefer mostly sun. I've grown them in partial shade before. And here's the fall anemone. So when we were looking through the spring plants, we looked at that spring anemone, which is white. The fall anemone is kind of a pale pink, and it's a little bit taller, and that one prefers shade as opposed to sun. But that's a nice fall bloomer. Asters, of course. Plumbago is a good one. We use some of that in the Ogden Botanical Gardens. It likes a lot of sun, but it has this really intense blue flower, and it gets this beautiful red fall foliage in the fall. Grasses, I haven't provided a big list of ornamental grasses, but we do have a list online through the Ogden Botanical Gardens. We have a ornamental grass garden at the Ogden Botanical Gardens. So there's a lot of different varieties to choose from. The main thing to remember is that grasses can take quite a bit of maintenance because they do need to be divided about every 3 years. And when you trim them back early in the spring, so you leave them uncut for the winter, but early in the spring you have to trim them back, and that can be a bit of a tedious process. But there's a lot of really awesome ornamental grasses to choose from, and that helps with that year-round interest. All right, so we're going to move into maintenance a little bit here so we can get through our annual section and talk about some of those. So deadheading, that can be sometimes necessary. I'm a little bit lazy when it comes to deadheading, but if you really want a long-term bloom, it's a good practice. Especially with annuals. I'm more focusing on perennials in terms of deadheading right now, but annuals definitely needed as well to keep those plants really vigorous. So when you deadhead, you want to kind of treat it same sort of concept in terms of pruning. When you're going back to the next node, whether it's a new leaf or a new bud or new stem. So always make sure you're not leaving this bare stem that's just going to kind of turn brown. A, it's not going to look very good, and B, it's not going to stimulate as good as growth as we want and vigor. So there's just some examples on deadheading. And then so, but not all plants require the nitpicking of deadheading. I've mentioned the Veronica in the past, previously in this presentation, that you can stimulate it to rebloom. Same with the catmint and some other things. So this is the Veronica, pretty much done blooming. As you can see, it kind of blooms from the bottom up. And so there's still some color, which would always cause us as gardeners to maybe hesitate. Oh, well, it still looks nice. There's some color there. But this is about to the point where you really want to start to just cut this plant back. So this is what that looks like. In this case, the plant's being taken down clear down to the crown, which is totally fine. I think it was just sort of woody and shaded out back there, and that worked out quite well. Depending on what the plant looks like, though, I might just cut the tops off and into some of that foliage, but leave some of that lush green. And then what happens is you get some regeneration here from the base of the plant. And then in a matter of several weeks, you get this flush of blossoms. And it's obviously not going to be as vigorous as the original plant, but definitely looks far better off than what this would look like within a matter of 3 weeks. This is going to just be brown. The foliage will start to turn brown. There's not really much to it. So this really helps keep the plant more vigorous, more healthy, and more tidy looking in the long run. I also threw in lavender. Because what I do with lavender is I like to make sure that after it's finished blooming that I trim off of those flower stalks, and I reshape and mound the lavender plant, and that's going to help it from getting terribly woody over time If you ever had those lavenders, they get really sprawly and kind of bare in the center and really woody. Pruning off and deadheading right after the bloom in summer can really help. So that's what I do, and that does a good job. These are just examples. This is what they kind of look like this spring. We got to it late last summer at the Ogden Botanical Gardens, and I kind of showed the master gardeners how to do that. And sometimes you're actually cutting into some of the foliage when you do that, which is totally fine, because you just don't want to leave those bare stalks in the lavender. This is a slightly evergreen plant, so there's been some winter damage there. So that could be also trimmed again early spring if you're seeing any of that. And just a light trim and shaping of the plant. So that's going to help kind of reduce any woodiness that you might have in misshapen lavender. So I like to just say, you know, in terms of cutting back or deadheading, don't be afraid of the scissors, especially in the case of annuals. You know, I get scissor happy with my annuals, the ones we're growing out in the greenhouse and in my container gardens. We don't want them getting leggy, and giving them a little haircut is how to reduce legginess. But the other thing is, you know, if you have these fall bloomers, that's a big one too, because for instance, the sedums, the Autumn Joy, and some of the taller varieties, they tend to look really nice and mounding, nice, tight, dense, tidy little foliage throughout the growing season before they start to put on those buds. And then the stems start to elongate, and then they bloom out, and they have this big, heavy, top-heavy flower, and the plant can tend to fall over. And especially in the instance that they're getting overhead watering. So one way to avoid that is to trim them down about 1/3 of the way around Memorial Day, or maybe even a little earlier for you guys. But just trim them down a bit to increase that vigor of the plant, that to help support, to make the plant a little bit more dense, to shorten those stems. And so it can support those big heavy blooms. And so that's definitely a helpful tip, especially in shady areas or where you're utilizing overhead watering. And then as long as you're cutting before that plant goes to bud out, then you're not going to be sacrificing any of those blossoms. So dividing perennials. So the reason we divide perennials is basically we're trying to regenerate new growth and vigor and flowering in the plant. So if you see a plant that's been doing fine for several years and then just, you know, starting to die out and struggle a little bit, then it might be time to take it out and divide it. And it's another way we can propagate our plant. So even if you want, if your plant is large enough and you want a couple of them in a couple different spots, then you can use division to do that. And then again, it just reduces the overall size, initial size at least, and avoid dieback in the center, especially in the case of grasses. So like I mentioned before, grasses do require some regular division, typically around once every 3 years. And that can be a challenge. You know, this is the shovel method, where you take 2 shovels and you dig them into that root mass, and then you pry them together, and that pops the root mass apart. And I've tried that, and it's worked. I've tried that on, I think it was either a miscanthus or a Carl Forester, but it wasn't as simple as it sounds. The other method I like to use is just a handsaw. So that works just as well with grasses, and that definitely reduces that sort of donut form that happens when you've got this dead area in the center of your ornamental grass. but then the outside is the only area where it's actually putting out new growth in the spring. So we want to try and avoid that. Once we start seeing that, we know it's definitely time to divide, and it's best to try to divide before that we get to that point. So that's one way to mitigate that. The general guideline in terms of timing with division is if it's a plant that blooms in the spring or early summer, then you want to divide it in the fall. If it's a plant that blooms in late summer or fall, you want to divide it in the spring. Honestly, if you divide a perennial, whether it be spring or fall, it's probably fine. You just want to avoid doing it in the heat of the summer. The only drawback is that for instance, if you divide a spring blooming plant in the spring, you're probably going to be sacrificing some of those blooms and the vigor of the blooms. So if it's a more tender plant, you may want to just try and stick to these guidelines. I listed kind of a procedure in terms of division. And I think this is a good, safe way to go in terms of dividing perennials. But, sometimes you can really get away with cutting it with your shovel and digging it out. I like to just recommend, especially the more finicky plants, trying to get as big as trying to remove the whole thing, but as minimal root damage as possible. So that's why, I've mentioned removing the entire plant and then carefully loosening the soil to decide where is a good place to make that division. So, but the tougher the plant, the better it can withstand that. So it just kind of depends on what plant material you're working with, how best you want to approach that method. Okay, so moving on to annuals. So we're going to talk about bed design, annual varieties, and container gardening. So annual bed design. So this is
Ellen?
is kind of, yeah.
Sorry, somebody has a question about pinching back perennials. Are you going to hit that?
Pinching back perennials.
To make them bushier and not so leggy.
Okay. Well, I would categorize that in the same concept as trimming them back. And so if there's a specific perennial, again, it was kind of what I mentioned with, let me go back to that slide.
Basil, they mentioned, but like
basil.
mums or a few others like that can get tall and leggy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So the mums for sure, I would go, okay, where's that slide again? Just a sec. I think I passed it. So it's kind of like that cutting back. So what I would do with mums is sometime in mid to late May, especially those tall ones that get to be really top heavy, take about 1/3 of them off. And as long as you do it before they bud out, that's going to help bush them out. So that would be my suggestion there. Try to reduce any overhead watering. In terms of basil, I've always been advised just not to let them go to seed, and I totally agree with that. So if they start to bloom out, just pinch off those blossoms if you're not harvesting any basil yet, but that's going to help keep it really bushy. And you can take even more than that too. But for the garden mums and asters, prune those back about 1/3 towards the end of May, and that will help push them out. Make sure they've got enough sunlight. Hopefully that answered that question. Okay.
It should be fine. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. I'm popping back and forth between some of these slides, so this is good. Thanks for your questions, guys. All right, so here's our little formula for annual bed design. So we like to utilize this formula at the Ogden Botanical Gardens, and this is what Susie Jones, she teaches an annual bed design class for our garden members for the Ogden Botanical and USU Botanical Center. So this is hopefully a way to help conceptualize sort of how we do it. And what we do, our formula is we have what we call our skeleton plants, our tendon plants, and our flesh plants. So our skeleton plants are going to make up of roughly 20% of the garden bed. And then the tendon plants will be roughly 30%. And then the other half are going to be all our flesh plants. So what we mean by skeleton plants is that's kind of the structure. If you think of the human body, that's kind of the structure of our bed. So that's going to provide the structure for the overall design. Now this particular bed here, this is the annual bed that we plant every year in front of our education building at the Ogden Botanical Gardens. And it's kind of a kidney bean shape a little bit. So we use the skeleton plants throughout the center to kind of shape and balance that bed. And then from there, we taper down into our tendon plants. And these are going to connect the inside to the outside, kind of like a human body, but they're complementing these skeleton plants, okay? So usually they're a little bit slightly less predominant in terms of size and stature, so to speak. And then they just kind of taper out from the center there. And it doesn't always have to be the center. It really depends on what your space is like, where your placement's going to be. But basically all it is vegetative layering and being strategic about plant material. And then our flesh plants, of course, these are typically the lower growing, more spreading plants. And they're just basically here to fill in all the gaps and moving from the center outward. So that's going to be our biggest fillers right there, our flesh plants. So we kind of need our showstoppers as our skeletons, and I'll go through some examples. But this is kind of our process when we're planning the design for our garden. If this might be something helpful for you to use personally, or helping a neighbor or something like that. But we come up with our plant material list based on, whether we've got a certain color scheme going on, like for example, here in our wedding beds, and what kind of plants we want. And then we categorize them as what's going to act as maybe our flesh plant, and then our tendon plants, and this would be more of a skeleton, and then our tendons, and then our flesh plants towards the outside. And so we can categorize that here in our Excel list, and then we just pop the pictures
Helen,
in. Mm-hmm.
I apologize. There's someone asking if you can give examples of skeleton, tendon, and flesh plants.
I do have a few examples coming up in the next slides. So I will talk about that.
Cool. We'll just wait.
Okay, awesome. Thanks. So that's just kind of how we conceptualize it. So just to kind of help you, and if that's helpful at all, but this is how we plan it out at the Ogden Botanical Gardens when we're coming up with our plant orders. And it makes it a lot easier when it's time to have our master gardeners come out and plant, and we're hectically throwing the plants out in the right spot. So, and then you can really visualize what that garden's going to look like.
There's groups also requesting copies because it's a little bit hard to read on the Zoom share.
Yeah, you'll have to remind me, Ton, but I'm
okay.
happy to do that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that that's hard to read. Did you guys get copies of the handouts?
Yes, they have digital copies of the handouts.
Okay, so they could zoom in, but it may still be kind of fuzzy because they're just screenshots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll shoot an email over to you after we're done.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Ton. You just have to remind me of things or else I'll never get to it. Okay, so I promise I'm getting to some examples in a minute, but first I'm just going to talk about plant placement within design and also what we do at the Ogden Botanical Gardens. So we like to kind of take the more natural look approach and try to avoid planting in lines whatsoever. However, you know, this is an example of planting in lines, and you can kind of see here how they've sort of used that, you know, maybe skeleton, tendon, flesh example a little bit here. And I'm not opposed to this. It's a very formal looking flower bed. And, you know, in a lot of scenarios, that's really cool. And I think the human eye is really drawn to these patterns and these lines. So in certain circumstances, that's great. So it's kind of just up to your taste and your opinion, but we like to go with more sort of the patchwork, a little bit look at the Ogden Botanical Gardens, and never really plant in lines, and try to keep a lot of our plants a little bit more scattered. So you know, even when we're doing our very structural flesh plants, we're not doing a straight line when we're planting those. And then just to talk quickly about color. So here's the color wheel. An analogous color basically means any color that's next to each other on the color wheel. And so that's kind of a nice, safe way to go when choosing different color schemes in the landscape. It's a little bit more soothing. It's very subtle in terms of changes in color. It's a little bit less, I guess, chaotic or dramatic. So that's what we would consider more of a safe color scheme. However, you know, when I used to work in the nursery and I would build annual planters all the time, and I would mess around with colors all the time and just pick out these really new, unique annuals and compare them and see what they look next to each other with this foliage or this plant color. And it's really hard to go wrong when you've got a whole big palette in front of you. So, but sometimes when you're planning and you only have so many colors and varieties available to you at the nursery, then you kind of have to stick with what's going to work. But the other thing I would say is that opposite colors, they have a use as well. Especially if you've got a smaller space, like maybe your front yard or your backyard's a little bit smaller. If you layer opposite colors, that can really give the illusion of a larger space. So you can kind of manipulate your palette based on that. And so here are some examples of skeleton plants. And again, this is very relative to the scale of what you're working with if you're planning a garden bed. So that area at the Ogden Botanical Garden is quite large. And we use a lot of annuals there. So our skeleton plants tend to be very large, but these are a few that we use or could be used as a skeleton plant. Sometimes they're a little bit more foliage. For the most part, I would stick to more foliage, like an interesting texture foliage base, but sometimes you can use larger, taller blooming plants, such as the black-eyed Susan. But we've often used purple fountain grass. Last year we used the castor bean, which was a big hit. That was way fun. They got absolutely massive, and people just loved them. They raved about them. Ornamental cabbage works well. That one doesn't get, I mean, for us it works amazing, even though it's usually typically grown as a cool season annual, but it works great for us all year, aside from sometimes getting some aphids on it. And it will get, you know, we kind of use it a little bit more of a tendon plant because it doesn't quite get as large as our fountain grasses and our castor bean. We also tend to use canna lilies, as well as, let's see, I'm going to move to the next slide, the New Zealand flax. I don't think we've ever used this elephant ear, but that's a really similar, just very dramatic type skeleton plant that gets quite large. There's another example of the purple fountain grass there. Cleome is another one that gets quite tall. So that would be an example of a nice, a good sized skeleton plant that you could utilize. Same with the king tut papyrus. So we used some papyrus last year as well. But the most dominant was definitely the castor bean last year. I wish I had a picture of last year's. I'm horrible at taking pictures while I'm out working, and so I need to be better at that to really beef up my presentation here. Zinnias also, so some of those larger, the state fair zinnias that get quite taller, those can be a really nice centerpiece or even a tendon plant. Some more examples of tendon plants. So this is our slightly less dominant. These are the ones that are going to be complementing the skeleton plants. I hope this is making sense. I feel like it's easy to conceptualize, but I think some people kind of like a real straightforward formula. But I really feel like you can manipulate this towards your own vision and kind of still follow the basic concepts. So you don't need A, B, C, this is what to plant necessarily. You can really be artistic in your own way based on your own space, but still kind of follow this concept a little bit. So, so the tendon, again, they're going to complement our skeleton plant. So, you know, in this example, it's kind of a close up, but we've got our purple fountain grass, and then we've got our cleome, our black-eyed Susans, our salvias, and then a bunch of flesh plants kind of intermixed between. So here are just some examples: the salvias, zinnias, gomphrena, geraniums, sun patience. Those are way fun, hard to come by. Dusty Miller is a really good tendon plant. Petunias, coleus, ornamental pepper. So these are all the plants that I'm providing here are ones that have done really well for us and that have been really really popular for our visitors. They've really enjoyed it. So we tend to kind of stick with, we like to try new things, but then we'll stick with some of the basics. So here's salvia, geranium. Lisianthus is a really fun, beautiful annual. We had problems with that flopping over because of we're at the mercy of our rainbird sprinklers. So we had to start staking those. We kind of shied away from those. But that is a really, really cool annual plant. Profusion zinnias, these are a little bit lower growing type of zinnia. They come in lots of different colors. They do amazingly in the landscape. They're really just cute and fun and happy. So those are always a good choice. The ornamental peppers have always been really popular. And the berries on the peppers too, they'll start to turn different colors. They'll be, you know, they'll go from purple to orange to red. Definitely not edible unless you want a stomach ache and your mouth to be on fire. So don't try that. We experimented with that and we decided that was a very bad idea. So don't try it. Gomphrena, that's another one we use year after year. This one is super fun. There's lots of different colors, but we tend to we get similar varieties or whatever the catalogs have available when we're doing our orders. But that's usually pretty easy to come by. And then again, there's a lot of different varieties of salvia. So they come in different colors. So that's the annual salvia. That's really nice tendon plant. So here's the gomphrena again. So we've used this variety, the fireworks. We've also used the strawberry fields. That's a really nice one. And then finally our flesh plants. So these are our fun fill in the gaps annuals. They're usually low growing. trailing, creeping, however you want to, whichever term you want to use. So things like sweet alyssum, sweet potato vine, lobelia, licorice plant, verbena, samvitalia, even wave petunias. So there's a lot of options with those. And
Ellen,
yeah, I saw
there's a
that going
question
on.
that says, I'm trying to figure out how to do this without planting in a straight line. Haha. Do you have an example layout kind of showing where you would typically put each of the 3 types of plants?
I don't have a layout available, like a map, so to speak. But literally what I do is I start from the center of this bed, and I'm literally throwing the plants out. I'm staggering my skeleton plants to fill in the space. Again, it's kind of this interesting sort of kidney bean shape. So I throw out the plants a little bit staggering. And I don't use just one type of, we don't use just one type of skeleton plant. We use a couple different. So we'll use fountain grasses or castor beans or just any kind of ornamental grass. We use, so anyway, we use several different types. And so that way you've got a little bit of a mixture there and you stagger them. And so everything is staggered. So basically I'll take one tray at a time and I'll walk through out, and I just toss them down on the ground, and where they land, they get planted. And that's how we go about it. And that's a great way to do it. So one tray, one variety at a time, making sure that you're staggering, trying to keep them. I mean, we plant 6 inches apart. We keep it really dense. I don't think that's 100% necessary, especially with things that spread a little bit more. But that's kind of my trick to it. I don't plan it out verbatim in terms of where these plants are going to go. So hopefully that's helpful. Was there another question there?
There is a comment saying 3 or odd numbers are always good for design. I like overlapping triangles, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. That kind of helps you conceptualize that. Yeah, usually in design, they do suggest odd numbers, so 3 or 5s. You know, I definitely agree with that, but I don't always think it's 100% necessary. Just it kind of depends on the location. But in this scenario, that would be.
Yeah, I've noticed that sometimes you can almost get stuff lined up like soldiers and less formal if you stick to that too hard. But generally, yeah, those odd numbers do look better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this picture here, that actually is, that's the area that used to be, that now has become our pollinator garden. So flesh plants. So yeah, so flesh plants. Here's some examples. We got petunias here. We got some samvitalia. We got some star zinnias. We got some smaller zinnias and things. Just a lot going on in terms of flesh plants, and that's what we're looking at here around the border. So alyssum, samvitalia, if you've never heard of that one, it's kind of a fun one. It works really great in containers. It's like a little mini black-eyed Susan. Lobelia and diacia. This is the licorice plant here. That one spreads really well, very aggressively almost, but it's kind of lower growing. Snowland daisy, vinca, calibrachoa. They also refer to that as million bells or mini petunias. And that also, that's a fun one for hanging baskets and planters. We've used heliotrope. Verbena is just fantastic. It fills up a lot of space. They come in a lot of different colors. They're very resilient, adaptable. So I'm a big fan of verbena. The star zinnias are really cute and fun and happy. So we use those quite a bit.
Ellen, there's a question about, says, I see where there's some shorter plants interplanted among taller ones. Do you not stress too much about the height, or do you have an amount difference in the size you like?
I don't stress too much about the height. This is a pretty big, large bed here. And we're just like from it also, you can see it from all different angles. So it kind of depends on your space and where you're looking. And you're right, there's a lot of variation. Maybe you were looking at this, and it doesn't just taper out exactly. So that's, again, it kind of helps with not having too much of a structure there. So I don't stress too much about that. And sometimes certain plants will kind of take over and get a little bit larger in some areas than other, and we don't have a lot of control over that. I hope that answered that question. Maybe it wasn't very clear, but no, I don't stress over it too much. It usually turns out pretty nicely as long as you stick to that formula as best you can. All right, so I think I was on this slide next. Here's some shade examples. I just thought I should provide some examples if you've got a shady area that you have to deal with, that you want to kind of landscape in, using some annuals and as well as perennials. You know, and going back to that design, you don't always have to use only annuals. I mean, you can have some permanent structure there. So our wedding bed design, it's in one of those Excel sheets that you saw with the yellows and pinks. That grass depicted as one of the skeleton plants, that's a perennial grass that's there year after year that we maintain. So you don't always have to, you know, plant new skeleton plants each year. So ferns, for example, we have a lot of ferns that are perennial and do really well here in Utah, and the bleeding hearts and things like that. So that would be a great skeleton plant for a shade area. Same with some of our hostas. Coleus as well. So Coleus, certain varieties can get quite tall as well. Shade tendon plants. I apologize. The only thing I put here were the tuberous begonias, but I know there's a lot of other options. Begonias in general do really well. Well, I mean, I guess they're actually, they can be a little finicky, but it is an option. Tuberous will work okay. Rex begonias are okay. They're just a little finicky in terms of watering, but they're absolutely beautiful. And impatiens are wonderful. Polka dot plants, things like that. Lots of perennials that work well. So, and on a similar note with design, in terms of containers, this concept, again, in my mind is really similar to it's called thriller, filler, spiller. So it's really catching. And I feel like it's really fairly similar to designing a annual bed, but basically you want your thriller, which is going to be your more upright, more dominant plant. And it doesn't always have to be in the very center of the container. But you definitely want something with height to kind of showcase the container and also reflect sort of the shape of the container as well. So if you have one or two, what we would call maybe thriller, and it doesn't have to be an ornamental type grass or anything like that. It could be a flowering plant. You could use something like a tall dahlia or a salvia. There's several other things we used to use as what I would term a thriller plant when I used to make containers all the time in the nursery. But and then your filler, again, a complementary plant, so that'll be a step down in terms of size. A lot of the times you can use geraniums. In this example, those are the African daisies or osteos. Diacia, calibrachoa, lots of options in terms of what we would call fillers. And it can be as colorful as you want, or it could be more heavy on the foliage. And even then with containers, utilizing perennials can be really stunning, especially with shade containers. I love using ferns and hostas, and even some perennial ground covers in containers. Like for example here, for their spiller, it almost looks like a variegated ivy, which is absolutely, you know, gorgeous. I love those variegated ivies. So I mean, it's kind of, with containers, you just got so much creative ability. But you definitely want to kind of look at something, at least one spiller, if, you know, it doesn't have to be around the entire pot. I think with hanging baskets, it's nice for everything to be drooping. So you really have this nice, big, full looking basket. But with some of these taller standing containers, even just a very simple, elegant spiller can look quite nice. So I'm way into containers, so I'll tell you about some maintenance. I make a ridiculous amount of containers. Actually, I've really reduced the amount of containers that I make anymore, but and I've also really reduced how much plant material I use. I get a lot of questions on, well, how many plants do you put in your container, and those kind of things. And it really kind of depends on how full you want it, how quickly. There's always a plant, if you overstuff, that's going to get choked out. They start to really fill in terms of root volume and start to dry out really quickly. And I just, you know, I kind of turned into more of a minimalist and chose the plants that I know I really like and that do well for me, and a lot of plants that I can overwinter, such as the geraniums and the diamond frost, euphorbia, and some of the dahlias and things like that. And then I'll just kind of fill in with sweet potato vines and wade petunias and salvia and things that I purchased from the nursery to supplement. So container maintenance, just for the sake of time, I'm going to go into some basics, but there's some resources for you. We have YouTube videos on container maintenance, on overwintering annuals, and planting containers. So look that up. Just extension, USU extension, container gardening, YouTube. You'll get all sorts of resources. So I was going to embed some of these, but then I learned that for some reason that was not working very well. And this presentation takes me a little while. So that's just something for you to look up on your own. They're pretty basic tutorials, but they can be helpful. I hope so anyway. So in terms of maintenance, watering containers. So the question throughout the landscape is always, how often should I water? How should I be watering? And that's all going to depend on soil type, environment, sun exposure, plant type, all those sort of things. So there's no perfect formula for that. But what I think is a wonderful tool is the soil moisture meter. And I utilize that in my landscape quite a bit. And it's been a very helpful tool in terms of knowing if it's time to water or not. Now, when it comes to containers, we definitely know we're watering on a pretty regular basis. So especially in Cache County, when I lived up there and I was doing a lot of container gardening, in the spring, it just, you know, it took a while for those plants to really get going, to get big, to start to really root out. And so in the springtime, you're not going to be treating those containers the way you would in the summer. So especially if you're planting your own and you're taking these transplants home, these annuals home, and you're creating your own container, and you have more of a soil volume in your pot or your planter than you do have root mass. So and the plants themselves aren't quite as large yet. So you just you don't want to be soaking them every single day like you would in the heat of the summer when they're full grown and totally root bound. So I just like to say, you know, check it either with a soil moisture meter or do a finger check and stick your finger down into the soil, feel that moisture down about where the root zone is. And if it's moist, then you probably should hold off, especially if it's a cooler spring day. So, but then in the summer, you're probably watering once, if not twice a day, especially for those sunshine containers. The shade containers, they may take a little bit longer to dry out. And I've had some shade containers that, you know, I've only had to water about every 3 days. So really just keep an eye on that, especially in the shade containers. Best time of day in general is when it's cool out, so morning or evening. However, whenever you have time, especially if you have to do it by hand, if you're home during a lunch break and you know it's going to get hot out in the afternoon, you know, if the plants haven't quite dried out yet, you may want to give it a drink anyway. So whenever you have time is the best time. And I just say that because I had a ridiculous amount of containers that I used to hand water. So I would do it when I could. Okay, great. So I covered most of that. And fertilizing containers. This is what I suggest. This is kind of the formula I've followed. Now, in terms of fertilizer, in case you don't know, we're looking at these numbers here. So these represent our NPK, or nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And so in the spring, I typically use a liquid form triple 14 if or as needed. I mix some kind of slow release fertilizer as well in the soil when I plant, unless there's already some existing in the potting soil that I've purchased. I do mix my own soil, so I like to supplement with something like an Osmocote or a slow release. But a triple balanced fertilizer, triple 14, triple 10, that's just a matter of percentage in terms of concentrate. And then come summer, that's when the blooms start to sort of fade out a little bit. The plants themselves get a little bit tired. That's when, you know, deadheading can be really important. In one of those videos, you can kind of look at some examples of how to do that and maintain your containers in the heat of the summer. But in the summer, I like to really up it on the phosphorus to help promote more blooms and to reduce that sort of just all greenery. And the reason we do have to fertilize so much with these containers is, especially in the summer, where we're watering so constantly, it's leaching out all those nutrients. And then I also like to just recommend having a chelated iron on hand. Again, with all that watering, we tend to get iron chlorosis in a lot of our annual plants. Particularly, I've had that problem a lot with my wave petunias and some other things. So it's good to have that on hand and to utilize it preventatively. So so that's kind of the quick scoop on container gardening and maintenance. So I'm gonna hit on common pests here, and then I will take some questions at the end. It's already 8:25. So so common pests, aphids, that's these little critters here. I think most of us have dealt with them before. Spider mites, that's a common problem. And pretty much a lot of different landscape plants. For my annuals, I tend to deal with budworms and a lot of my perennials as well. And this is just a little caterpillar that eats the flowers from the inside out before the flower buds open up.
Helen,
so sometimes you don't even notice.
Someone is asking, will you share your particular potting mix?
Yeah, absolutely. So so I do it in bulk. I purchase from Steve Reagan a big bale of sunshine mix. usually a number 2 or number 4. It's just a professional growers mix. And then I purchase expanded perlite. And then I have to search around for the right amount of coconut coir, but I do like to use coconut coir. You can use peat moss instead of coconut coir. I just kind of like the texture of coconut coir. And I basically mix that in equal parts. And it will fill up. I usually have to buy a few bags of coconut coir, but between everything else, I can get at least 2 full garbage containers worth of soil. So it's a bit of an investment, probably around 60 bucks, 65, 70 bucks. But if you mix it yourself, it's a little cheaper and it's fun. So that's my formula.
That's all the questions for right now.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. Okay, so the budworms, tobacco budworms can also be a problem. They particularly like my petunias and my geraniums, and then earwigs can be a problem. So here's just a few management options. I like to just say, you know, let's encourage beneficial insect populations as best we can, reduce a lot of chemical application, but sometimes we just have to go about our chemicals. So there's some organic options as well. Insecticidal soap works well. Diatomaceous earth, that's basically a mineral that's ground up that affects crawling insects, but also can deter insects. BT, or Basilicus thuringiensis, is another organic option. And that one will, that's more of a specialized insecticide where it only affects the caterpillars. Spinosad is a pretty broad spectrum organic insecticide, and that can work well with heavy insect pressure, and that's another good option for vegetable gardens because it has a very short residual. So when I've had earwigs on my green beans and things, that I knew that would kind of deter them a little bit, but I could still harvest my green beans within a matter of days. It's something you don't want to utilize too often, too frequently, because I've seen insects become resistant to that fairly quickly. So there's options out there. You know, you can always go to our utahpest.usu.edu for more IPM advisories and information on dealing with some of these insect pests. So we have a lot of resources out there for you, but keep an eye out for those. They can definitely go after your plants and cause problems. So here are the resources. I mentioned the Center for Water Efficient Landscaping. So they have a lot of cool resources there. They've got some publications. They also have this guideline on water-wise landscaping, just going through principles of planning and design. So that might be a helpful resource for you. This is our Ogden Botanical Gardens website. And this is the page where our garden map and plant list is. So if you're interested in learning more about some of the plants that we talked about, or if you're ever there out visiting, we do have a list of plants per garden, which will be continuing to be updated. But you know, we don't have photographs along with them, but if you're wandering around, you can kind of see what sort of plants are in each garden. And then, of course, the USU Botanical Center, their website, some of the things that are going on. A lot of our classes and events right now are being rescheduled, postponed, doing virtually, things like that. But we do have a really great membership program. And the Gardener's Almanac is kind of a fun resource. It's sort of a monthly to-do list that you can refer to that can be helpful. So that ends my presentation here, and I'm happy to stick around to answer my questions. I'm sorry I got a little bit speedy at the end there, but in the interest of time, I thought I should rush through.